Well, welcome to this special briefing for pastors, church leaders, and the heads of religious institutions that we're calling Ask First Liberty. It is the first of what we hope will become a series of conversations as we discuss the importance of religious liberty, especially during this time of uncertainty due to the coronavirus. I'm Jeremy Dice, one of the attorneys here at First Liberty.
And I'm Justin Butterfield, another of the attorneys here at First Liberty.
Well, on any normal day, Justin and I would be carrying out the mission of First Liberty Institute by defending religious liberty for all Americans. And usually that consists of meeting with clients, drafting briefs, and generally litigating these important issues. But these aren't ordinary days, are they? In fact, probably like those listening, neither of us are in our office, and we don't have any flights to meet with clients scheduled anytime soon. In fact, I'm sitting at a makeshift desk inside my social distance containment unit, also known as my bedroom. But that's actually why we're here on this call with each of you today. And we've received a lot of calls and emails from around the country, all of them having to do with the coronavirus. While many are understandably concerned about the health, their questions are being asked to us that have to do with the government's response to this pandemic. Questions like, can the government stop large gatherings? What if those are religious gatherings? How long can they prevent churches from meeting during a pandemic? And whatever happened to the free exercise of religion and the right of a people peaceably to assemble? Those are the kinds of questions we want to answer today and on our website at firstliberty.org. And thankfully, we have just the man to answer these questions. For those of you who don't know, not only did my colleague Justin Butterfield graduate from Harvard Law School, so we know he's a fairly intelligent guy, he recently returned to First Liberty from the United States Department of Health and Human Services, where he specifically worked on matters of conscience and religious freedom inside the department's Civil Rights Division. So, Justin, tell the folks listening today just a little bit more about your work at HHS and what it entailed.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so I was the first ever senior advisor for conscience and religious freedom at the Department of Health and Human Services, and my job was to make sure that HHS respected Americans' religious freedom and that federal laws protecting religious freedom that are under HHS's purview are enforced. So basically, I spent a little over 2 years making sure that healthcare in America and religious freedom in America can work with each other instead of against each other.
Well, it looks like we've got the right guy on the line to answer these questions then. And before I go any further, let me pause here to say that while our callers are on mute right now, toward the end of this program, towards the end of this call, we'd like to invite your participation as well. If you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways you can do it. First, for those who are listening live, just press *# on your phone. *# will put you into a queue, and you'll be able to ask your question live in just a very few moments. Or you can also email your question to askfli@firstliberty.org. That's askfli@firstliberty.org, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can during our time together this morning. But Justin, let me turn to you. Folks are worried enough about their health right now. They should not be worried about their religious freedom, too. Now, last Friday on our website at firstliberty.org, we issued guidance to churches and religious organizations faced for the first time in our collective memory with the widespread government-imposed bans on gatherings over a certain size that would, in all likelihood, shut down most shared religious activities, especially church services and other religious gatherings. But before we get deep into those questions, just walk me through, and those that are listening on the phone, walk us through what our guidance was.
Sure. So first, we wanted to make clear how important it is for churches and other houses of worship to continue to serve their community at this time. Throughout history, churches and religious institutions have always been at the forefront of caring for the community in times of sickness and danger. And Jeremy, I know that you have a really interesting story to tell about that, and maybe in a little bit you can share that. Second, we noted that temporary, evenly applied restrictions on religious gatherings may be permissible. And this is a difficult issue, and we're going to spend most of our time today talking about what is permissible and how that all works legally. And finally, we explained that extraordinary state action to limit the peaceful gathering of American citizens must be temporary. And I think we can explain that further, too, as we talk. But that's the gist of the guidance we issued at firstliberty.org.
But that was a week ago, of course, and a lot has changed since then. We've all gone into lockdown. The economy has been strained, and even opening day for Major League Baseball is delayed, or it might even be canceled. So let's get right into the big question, and probably the most fundamental question that people are asking today. Are these mandatory lockdowns, Justin? Are these mandatory lockdowns and bans on large gatherings, are they even constitutional?
And the answer, Jeremy, as is so often the case, It depends, but what we're seeing right now is generally permissible. And I agree that this is probably the issue that, as a lawyer, I've been getting the most questions about, and that is the most troubling to a lot of people. So, how should we think about these laws that we're seeing all around the country? And something to note here, the United States is in many ways unique because it's hard to talk about what the law is in the United States. Unlike many countries, the United States has 50 states, each of which is a sovereign government. And in addition to that, there are almost 40,000 local governments of various sorts, cities, townships, counties, etc. And the US Constitution and state constitutions divide power up among these three levels of government. We call this federalism. And if you hear the United States referred to as a federal republic, that's what the word federal is referring to. So, we've seen different states responding to COVID-19 in many different ways. Some states have issued suggestions or guidelines for their residents to voluntarily follow. Other states, like Illinois and Ohio, California, have taken stronger measures, such as mandating the closure of non essential businesses, limiting the sizes of groups that can meet, or even requiring their citizens to stay home. And even within states, we're seeing different local governments taking very different approaches to how they handle COVID-19. Before California instituted their statewide requirement that citizens stay home, we saw San Francisco and the Bay Area generally had imposed that sort of lockdown that required their residents to stay home with relatively few exceptions.
Right. And we even saw the same thing in, I think, Laredo, Texas earlier this week.
That's right. And even though Texas generally has gone more the route of providing guidance to people to voluntarily follow to limit the spread of COVID-19, cities within Texas can take stronger actions if they feel that they need to do so.
Okay, so we've seen recommendations from the federal government, whether that's from the CDC, President Trump, the Surgeon General, but then governments like Andrew Cuomo, or these governors around the country, like Andrew Cuomo in New York, just this morning, as a matter of fact, required the state's workforce to stay home, leaving open only the state's essential businesses. And last night, Governor Gavin Newsom of California issued an order requiring California's 40 million citizens to stay in their homes except for, quote, essential activities. And then there are city mayors. They're also closing restaurants and limiting gatherings of certain sizes, full-on lockdowns here. What gives cities and states the power to do these things?
Sure. So, unlike the federal government, which has limited powers that the Constitution spells out, what we lawyers call the enumerated powers, enumerated just means they're numbered, they're specifically listed, and the federal government can only do what's listed. But the Constitution gives states broad power to pass laws, specifically power to pass laws that protect the health, safety, and morals of their citizens. And we call that power the police power. Jeremy, you may recall the 10th Amendment.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites, as a matter of fact. The 10th Amendment is what I call the catch-all amendment because it says that the powers that were not expressly conveyed or, as you said, enumerated to the government in the Constitution, those are then reserved to the states or to the people. I love that amendment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the power to pass laws to protect health, safety, and morals, the police power, has always been regarded as one of those powers that the Constitution gives to the states or the people. And in fact, states, counties, and cities use this police power to protect their citizens' health all the time, even without the specter of COVID-19 that we're seeing right now. So, for example, we've all heard the horror stories of an unsanitary restaurant being closed down to protect the health of the people who would have eaten there. And you have states that license or set standards for different types of workers that might affect the public's health. We see licensing for doctors, dentists, even hairstylists. So we encounter the power of state and local governments to regulate for health all the time, just usually not to such an extent that we're seeing right now in the face of COVID-19.
Okay, well, that raises then a very important question because we're not talking about dirty diners, unsanitary restaurants, and the hair salon. We're talking about churches, and we're talking about synagogues and other religious institutions that are being told by the government that they can't meet when their faith says that they must. Where then is the line between what is permissible and what is not? How do we know what's a permissible use of police power and then what is too far?
That's right, Jeremy. Well, as you're aware, the First Amendment, which because of the 14th Amendment also applies to the states, the First Amendment protects things like the right of the people to peacefully assemble, that is, to gather in groups. So how can a state order people to not assemble in groups? Or even, as we've seen with California, stay home? And the answer to that is that when a law restricts a fundamental freedom, it is subject to what we call strict scrutiny, which means that the courts will strike down the law unless the government can show three things. First, that the law furthers a compelling governmental interest, that is, an interest of the highest order, such as preserving national security or saving the lives of a lot of people. Second, that the law is narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling interest. That is, that it not only does what it needs to do to further that interest, but it doesn't go beyond what is necessary for that purpose. And finally, that the law is the least restrictive means to achieve that interest. That is, if there's any other way that's less burdensome on our freedoms, then the law is invalid.
Okay, so that gives us a legal framework when looking at actions by the government that impose burdens on our freedoms and especially our religious freedom. So the government must further a compelling interest. They have to narrowly tailor that action to meet that interest, and then they have to use the very least restrictive means to achieve that goal. And that's, I guess, great for maybe a law school discussion or a law school exam even. But what does it mean practically? Walk us through how these steps apply to our current context within the coronavirus pandemic.
Sure. So consider a ban on gatherings of 10 or 25 persons or more. First, is there a compelling interest? And the government has explained that their interest is in flattening the curve of infection, as they call it. That is, slowing the spread of COVID-19 enough so that different groups of people get sick at different times to ensure that everyone doesn't catch COVID-19 all at the same time and flood our hospitals beyond their capacity to help. Effectively, the compelling interest here is in saving a lot of lives. And I think pretty much everyone agrees that this is a compelling governmental interest. One factor that is used as evidence of whether there's truly a compelling governmental interest is what sort of exceptions are there to the law? Do the exceptions make it seem like the government really doesn't want the law violated? Or do the exceptions make it seem like the interest isn't really that big of a deal? So, for example, if you have a law that said you can't gather in groups of 10 or more unless you're at a sporting event, then courts are likely to say, well, that's not really a compelling governmental interest, or else you'd be willing to stop the sporting event also. But the laws I've seen have only made exceptions for things that are essential to saving lives. Sporting events haven't been exempted, so I think the laws we've seen so far pass this test.
Okay, so the government then can't say, well, churches can't meet, but movie theaters can, as if, movie theaters are less containing of viruses than churches would be. It's either a compelling interest for everyone concerned, or it's just not that compelling, right?
Exactly right. So once you have a clear, compelling interest, the next question is whether stopping groups of people from gathering in person is narrowly tailored to further that interest. And here again, the government has explained that their infectious disease transmission models show that the best way to slow the spread of this disease is to limit exposure to others. And I think that makes sense, especially with something like this coronavirus that can be carried for up to 2 weeks without showing any symptoms. You can infect a lot of people without realizing it in 2 weeks. And again, a counterexample would be if the government said you can't meet with others in any way, including by telephone. Then that law would not be narrowly tailored because there's no connection between talking with a group of people over the telephone or over the internet and the spread of COVID-19. But we haven't seen laws that attempt to block groups of people from communicating, only from gathering in person.
Well, that makes sense. That's part of the social distancing thing. Stay physically apart, but using the phone and the internet to hold meetings, well, that's just fine. And that clears up what's meant by a compelling interest in how the government acts to narrowly tailor its actions to meet that interest while imposing that burden. But I think you said something about the least restrictive means. What does that mean?
Well, the least restrictive means is probably the hardest prong of the test for the government to meet. And that is there any other way that is less infringing on our freedoms that would accomplish the same goal? For example, if simply wearing a mask could slow the spread of COVID-19 as effectively as not being around an infected person, then instead of a ban on gatherings, the government could simply mandate that everyone who goes out wear a mask. As we've seen, however, wearing masks while it can limit some aspects of transmission, if you're not infected and you're wearing a mask, it turns out it may actually increase your chance of acquiring COVID-19. So that's not a less restrictive means. Without something like a vaccine or a sure way to stop the transmission of COVID-19, there really is no other way that's as effective. So the ban on public gatherings passes this prong too.
Well, I think that's very helpful. Now, before we move on, we're going to take questions in a moment. So if you have a question for Justin, now's the time to press star pound or email your question to Ask First Liberty or askfli@firstliberty.org. So press star pound if you're live here now, or if you have another question, send it to askfli at firstliberty.org. And we're going to try to get to all of those, or as many as we can, in just a moment. All right, now that we have the rubric that's been outlined here, Justin, and thanks for that, what about when this government action begins to affect our churches or our houses of worship? After all, churches and other places of worship or religious exercise have special protections in the Constitution. Do they get stronger protections than, say, 25 people meeting in the back room of a restaurant or at a baseball game?
Well, you're right, Jeremy. Religious organizations do have stronger protections than 25 people at the back of a restaurant. Religious freedom, the first freedom in the Bill of Rights, has very strong protections in our Constitution, and those rights do come into play here. The most important extra protection that churches and other places of worship or religious exercise have, that places like movie theaters, restaurants, and sports arenas don't have, is the requirement that the government not treat churches or other religious groups worse than the government treats similarly situated non-religious groups. What this means is that if there's a facility in your city that is open to groups of 25 or more, then the government cannot permit that facility to remain open, but force churches to close without a really good reason.
Well, what sort of really good reason are we talking about here?
Well, it has to be a reason for which, again, there's either compelling interest to treat them differently, or the facility is so different from the church with respect to transmission that you can't consider them as even similar. So, for example, the city decides that a hotel can remain open because even though it's open to 25 or more people, they all stay in their rooms divided into groups of usually 1 to 3 or 4. Or the city keeps hospitals open so that they can actually treat those who are in serious medical attention. These are not similarly situated to the church with respect to disease transmission. But on the other hand, imagine that a city decides, hey, people need an outlet. They've been cooped up for 2 weeks now. We're going to go ahead and let movie theaters open up for a couple days. If the city does that, then it must also permit churches to open as well, because the same considerations that go into whether to keep theaters open or closed apply to churches. They are similarly situated, and churches cannot be discriminated against in those situations.
Okay, so if the city says, hey, we're going to allow groups to go ahead and gather at movie theaters or libraries or some such thing, they also then have to allow groups to gather for church?
Exactly right.
Oh, okay. So they can't pick and choose shutting down religious organizations, but opening up similarly situated secular ones.
That's right. That would be unconstitutional behavior by the government. But Jeremy, this isn't the first time in our history that we've had to deal with this. I think you wrote about that in the New York Post this morning. So why don't you tell us about what happened in 1918 with the Spanish flu and how that helps guide us today?
It's a very interesting discussion and a great story from history. Back in 1918, when all the soldiers were returning from World War I across the globe, they started to spread became known as the Spanish flu. And in Washington, D.C., which would see quite a few deaths from the Spanish flu and the outbreak there in the District of Columbia, the health officials there put out a similar ban on large gatherings. And they specifically asked churches not to be meeting during that time. And there was a lot of pushback by the pastors at that time. In fact, the local pastors association and all the religious leaders, they got together and they discussed this issue and kicked it around a bit. And what resulted from that was an official resolution by the pastors of the city of Washington, D.C., in which they indicated that they cheerfully would comply with the request of the local health department. And so they did. They were willing to comply with that, recognizing that love for neighbor required them to consider the spread of this disease in ways that they could end it. And so they also recognized, I think, an important element of this discussion, which is this, that while the churches in our houses of worship have a certain sphere of authority that our religious liberty recognizes and our First Amendment protects, they also recognize that there is a legitimacy to our government, and there's a certain amount of trust we can put into our health officials in determining these important issues and, frankly, these very difficult issues. And so I think we can learn a lot from that lesson of history of how these pastors and churches decided to employ other means. In fact, they encouraged their congregations, even in that resolution, to go back to worship together as a family and spend their time in isolation praying for the sick and for a quick resolution to the outbreak of that flu. And as it turned out, that decision ended up saving a lot of lives. So it's a great question, a great opportunity for us to learn from our history. All right, well, let's now turn from kind of this legal discussion to a few of the questions that I think that are out there. And remember, you can press *# on your phone to ask a question or send your questions to askfli@firstliberty.org. Our first question is going to come by way of email, and it's coming from our friend Dick in Wisconsin. He says, I'm a pastor of a church in north central Wisconsin. Because of the rules regarding congregating in groups of 10 or less, I'm pondering scheduling a drive-in church service. People would come to church, park in the parking lot, roll down their windows, and then they would hear a Palm Sunday or Easter service broadcast over the speakers. As pastor, he says, I would stand behind a podium on the lawn and deliver my message. People would be more than 6 feet away from one another. We could even sing hymns together, and perhaps neighbors could be introduced to the love of the Savior. Would such an approach be legal and proper under these circumstances? Well, I think that, Justin, is a very creative idea. In fact, the pastors that I was just talking about a few moments ago in Washington, D.C., in 1918, they did something very similar, although I think they probably did it without cars, if you think about it. They met outside in the parks, but eventually the health authorities asked them to even stop those meetings, and they did out of love for neighbor because that was what was required then. So maybe this is a very creative solution suited just for 2020, but I think at the same time we should be exercising an abundance of prayer and prudence as we approach that idea. But I think in general it's a very creative idea, one that just might work. Justin, what do you think?
I think that's exactly right. And let me first just note that, as I mentioned earlier, there are almost 40,000 different governments in the United States and probably more than 40,000 different responses to the coronavirus among them. And we're seeing state and local governments updating their rules with respect to coronavirus almost daily. So even if we give you advice about what is presently permissible, that advice may be wrong by tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe even 5 minutes from now.
Exactly. So for this particular pastor's question, if we look at the order from that the governor of Wisconsin issued, it says mass gatherings are prohibited in the state of Wisconsin. Mass gathering is any planned or spontaneous public or private event or convening that will bring together or is likely to bring together 10 or more people in a single room or single confined or enclosed space at the same time. So right now, the idea of a drive-in church looks like it would work. You're not meeting in a single room or enclosed space at the same time. Now, there may be other city or county rules to consider, so you'd want to look into what those rules are and make sure that they don't have any nuances that would change that. But right now, based on the present version of Wisconsin's rule, it looks like that would in fact work. And this is definitely a creative solution that should be okay for now.
Well, it's good. It just sounds like you can't bring your 15-passenger van to the outdoor church service, but beyond that, it looks like it might be a good solution. Well, okay, let's see if we have any questions of those on the line here now that we can answer. Patricia, I think you're monitoring and putting people in queue over there. Do we have a question?
Absolutely. Looks like we currently have 8 participants in queue wanting to ask a question. One moment, please, for our first question.
Hey, this is Pastor Sam Jones. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you well. Go ahead and ask your question.
All right. Well, so with the 3 criteria that was given in order to suspend, essentially, or to go against, not suspend, but to go against the First Amendment, I'm in Iowa, and in our area, in our county specifically, we still have non-essential work going on, like factory work at John Deere that has hundreds of employees within the same building, and yet we're prohibited from having 10 gather in our church. I'm curious, how does that actually meet the criteria, considering non-essential work is still going on?
Well, that's a tough question, and thank you, Pastor Johnson, for that question. And Justin, we're going to see a lot more of these kind of questions, especially as we get governors like Governor Newsom and Governor Cuomo and many others that are saying just the essential services have to be out there. How do people evaluate what is an essential service and what might not be in relationship to the question that was just asked?
Yeah, you're right. That is a difficult question. And the way that we think about it is, are they similar for transmission purposes? And there's also some room for what is an essential service. And I think right now the courts are going to generally defer to, the government is saying that, well, this production line needs to stay operational. And that may be because it's instrumental in keeping the food supply running. Or they may convert them to, I've seen several factories that have been converting to creating, ventilators and other medical supplies that are necessary for the treatment of the COVID-19 virus. So there's factors like that to think about. But the other thing is, when you're meeting in a church service, everybody's kind of interacting with each other in a more closer, more intimate way. And it's a lot of times factories can separate people out, so separate them farther away. So while there may be instances where what the government says is permissible is just so similar to what the church is doing that it would be problematic. And I mentioned things like movie theaters or gyms or other sorts of things like that, where they're talking about aspects of infrastructure like a factory. Right now, I don't think we've seen that. That's not a problem right now. Now, if in a few months the government starts relaxing restrictions on all these other types of organizations, but they're keeping the churches closed down, that would be a problem. But right now, I just don't think that's an issue.
Right. So basically, a John Deere factory, for instance, is not quite similarly situated to First Baptist Church of Ames or something like that. You certainly sit a lot closer at the church than you might at the factory floor. And I think at the same time, I think we'll all acknowledge that we got to give the government a bit of grace here to try to figure out exactly how to arrive at a solution for a rather unprecedented threat to our society and, frankly, our economy today as well. But thanks so much for that question. Patricia, you got another question waiting for us?
Absolutely. One moment for our next question.
Hello there. This is Christopher Veed, Stafford, Virginia. I have a question. A lot of places, like the president has ordered for mobile testing sites and so forth like that. And I noticed that a lot of the places are choosing, like the Walmarts, the CVS, the major places. Obviously, their capacity might not be to the full extent when you talk about people going out and shopping and so forth like that to get their groceries. Do you think that at some point that they might try to choose churches that are either medium size or large size in nature to act as those testing sites, and can they actually legally do that?
Well, thanks for that question. I think that's a really good question. And my mind immediately goes, maybe, Justin, you have the same thought, to polling times or election centers where people will go to cast their vote. And frankly, we're doing a lot of that even now. I think the governor of Ohio moved their date back maybe to this coming Tuesday. They may have to move it again. But the reality is that churches are a lot like other buildings. They have doors and they have rooms and they allow people to come into them as a community gathering space. And that's how they've been used throughout our history. And so it's perfectly appropriate for churches to be used for things like polling places, or even perhaps I could see in the future, even them using them for testing centers like what you're seeing at Walmart, CVS, and other places. But maybe that's part of the analysis. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. If there's a church that's really convenient, quite frankly, I think that's a great way for churches to serve the community by helping facilitate people get tested if they're in a region where COVID-19 testing is appropriate. So I think that's certainly an option for churches. With respect to keeping Walmart open for shopping, grocery shopping is one of those essential services. If it's not good to save people from the virus if they starve to death. So we've seen grocery stores kept open. I think that again fits perfectly appropriately. So yes, the churches, if they want to volunteer to have COVID-19 testing, that's fine. And I think that the keeping grocery stores open is fine also.
Yeah, that's a great point on the volunteer side of that. The polling places are also done by volunteerism, not by commandeering or anything like that. So if your church is willing to do that and wants to participate in that, of course, that's a good thing perhaps a good thing for your community to be doing. We're going to have another question here in a second, but let me remind you that the guidance that we talked about earlier in this program is available for you to be able to download at firstliberty.org, and a copy of this program also will be published on our website at firstliberty.org as well, so you can share that with those who weren't able to make it on the call today. But Patricia, let's hear from another caller.
Absolutely. One moment for our next question.
Hello, this is Dr. Dale Burrows in Florida, and I think you've answered a good number of my questions. I had participated in something called close to martial law back in the 60s up in Detroit when we had the riots, and I was noticing that they had a curfew where you couldn't go outside between 5 and 11 at night and 6 in the morning. Do you see that being a problem for us?
I think we certainly hope not. And thanks very much for that question. Look, the experience of the rest of the world has been that a lot of the social distancing units that have been, or the time that we spend in isolation and away from folks has helped reduce the spread of the virus. That's up to really the government to give us some more guidance on. And frankly, maybe that's a question for a later episode that we may come back with here, or a later call that we can come back in a couple of weeks as things begin to change. But for our purposes, we're here to talk mostly about the impact of religious liberty. And Justin, let's say that in a couple weeks things become worse and not better, and the government's got to take extra steps. Does the analysis that we've gone through here today make any change?
Not really. I mean, these are the legal principles that are going to apply. So as things change, what constitutes the compelling interest might change. If there's a better, less restrictive means that's developed to stop transmission, that may change the analysis. But these sorts of guidelines are what we're going to be looking to. And it's going to be kind of what are the factors within each of those, and what is the present state of the country that's going to help us determine where that line should be drawn.
Well, Justin, I think we're running out of time for our call today, and I want to make sure everybody can get back to their efforts. But that doesn't mean that our discussion ends. There's a lot more for you to learn about at firstliberty.org, and you can download not only our guidance there, but also the audio of this interview will be available for you to review and download later today as well. But as a programming note, I want to give you something to think through for next week as well. There's a lot more issues here to discuss. Even questions today raised more interesting matters for us to think on and to discuss next week. And so we're going to return again next Friday at the same time, when we want to turn from some of the hard questions about banning large gatherings. And I think it's time for us to turn to some good things that we can focus on even in these circumstances. And so, Justin, before we go, looking ahead to our discussion next week, what are some of the things that religious groups can do during this really unprecedented time when a lot of people may be in special need of ministry?
Yeah, there are a lot of people right now who need the church, people who are at particular risk to COVID-19 and can't go out, who may need assistance getting their groceries, people who are temporarily out of a job and may need assistance paying their rent. And we all need prayer at this time, or all the time. There are a lot of opportunities for religious organizations to minister in more one-on-one ways. And, if you are continuing to meet because you're in an area that hasn't banned group meetings, or your services are small enough that you don't reach the meeting size limits, you might consider things like holding separate services for now for elderly and high-risk people who are most vulnerable to COVID-19.
Yeah, and this is a great time to find ways to be not only to care for one another in our communities, but to be creative in doing so.
That's right.
Well, thanks for joining us this week. And Justin, thank you for helping us think through these hard questions. And thanks to each of you for calling in today. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but rest assured, this is just the first edition of Ask First Liberty. And be sure to go to firstliberty.org for this and other future episodes or other calls we may have concerning this and other issues of religious freedom, along with the many other resources that are available to you. Until next week, I'm Jeremy Dice.
And I'm Justin Butterfield.
Have a great weekend, stay safe, and may God bless America.